We have more biographical information about Mary Magdalene than virtually any other New Testament woman, with the exception of Our Lady. I mean, if all of this comes together in the way that the tradition argues, if Aquinas and Augustine and all these saints and mystics who intuited the truth of the traditional view, if they're correct, then we can look at all these texts throughout the Gospels, seeing this as one woman, one heart devoted to Christ, then suddenly we know a huge amount about her compared to her contemporaries. Hello and welcome back to our course on St. Mary Magdalene. So far in the course, we have done a lot of arguments, we've done a lot of looking at biblical evidence and data. We've defended the traditional view that Mary Magdalene is the same woman as the sister of Martha and Lazarus. She is that woman who anoints Jesus' feet in Luke chapter 7. We've responded to some of the major objections to that view, and that's all been really great. But now I think we are going to get into the heart of this course, into the best part of the course. As a student of theology, I love arguments, I love the inferences, and I love going through the biblical texts in a scholarly and studious lens. But none of that compares to the real heart of the Christian faith, the relationship aspect, the journeying in friendship with Christ, which Mary Magdalene teaches us so much about. And so in this episode and in the next and final episode, that's where we're really going to dive into some of that. And what I want to do in this episode is begin by just tracing a bit more of the traditional narrative of Mary Magdalene's life. We're now in a position where we can do that in a really poignant way. So let's think through what we know about Mary Magdalene, given the truth of the traditional view. We know that she grew up in a devout Jewish home, likely in Bethany. She had two siblings at least, Martha and Lazarus. She was raised in the faith of Israel. But at some point in her adolescence, as we've talked about already, she fell away from that faith. She left home. She traveled north to Galilee. Why did she do that? Well, quite likely because the Sea of Galilee was known as the exciting place in ancient Judea. I mean, if you've ever been to the Sea of Galilee, it's stunning. I remember when I was there, just looking out at this beautiful sea, this beautiful lake, it reminded me of Lake Garda in northern Italy, and I really thought, if this was located in Central Europe, it would be a massive holiday destination. The Romans who occupied Judea at that time, they thought the same thing, and so many of the cities on the Sea of Galilee became holiday spots. They became vacation home places for Romans, coming from the sweltering busyness of Judea, of Jerusalem, especially in the south, and coming up to the north, to Galilee region, and settling there. And so it makes sense that Mary Magdalene, if she was looking for excitement, looking for worldly pleasures, she would leave the little town of Bethany, her childhood home, she would travel north to Galilee, to the seaside. And so that's what we know, and we know that she, at some point, she encountered the person of Christ. She encountered this strange male Jewish rabbi who was giving a message that was unlike any other. And so though she'd become embroiled in a life of sin in one of the cities in Galilee, although she'd garnered this reputation for herself as a woman of the city, as a sinner, as St. Luke calls her, she at some point encountered the preaching of Christ. And so upon encountering that, she has this conversion moment, this decisive encounter with Christ in her spiritual life. She comes and she anoints his feet, and then she goes on to become one of his best friends and one of the patrons of his ministry. We've talked about that already, that she was someone who helped to fund Jesus' ministry. She's someone who introduced Jesus to her childhood home, introduced him to her siblings. He became very close with the whole family. She walked with Christ throughout his ministry, throughout his 3 years of ministry. She helped to support the disciples. She was one of the women involved in that task. And then, of course, we know that she, once again, when he was staying down in Bethany, she anoints his feet a second time, and she's there as well at Calvary. She's there in his final hours. She's there when he's laid in the tomb, and she's there, of course, at the resurrection. So by looking at the traditional view in its totality, by taking the relevant scriptural texts and kind of piecing them together, we're able to look at this narrative and sort of draw this narrative in an inferential way. And it turns Mary Magdalene into this really sort of stunning saint, I believe. And we're going to get into that in some more detail very soon. Before we do that, just a quick word on Mary Magdalene's title. What does the title of Magdalene actually mean? This is something that in my own research I got into some detail, and I realized there's a couple of different scholarly opinions. The majority opinion and the more traditional opinion is that Magdalene is a reference to the city of Magdala. And the city of Magdala is one of those cities that I mentioned on the Sea of Galilee. Magdala was known to be, we know from archaeological evidence, from Talmudic evidence, it was known to be a morally corrupt place. It was one of these vacation spots for these sort of debaucherous Romans. And so Magdala being the city, Magdalene is drawn from that city. And so what Magdalene functions as a title is a little bit what something like, if we were to say Mary Las Vegan today. The title denotes notoriety. I mean, if you met someone called Mary Las Vegan, you would probably expect that they were going to be somebody with a bit of a track record. In the case of our dear Mary Magdalene, however, the title, yes, initially denotes notoriety, but after her conversion, it becomes a banner of triumph. It becomes the title symbolizing Christ's conquest of sin and death in her life. She continues to bear that name because it's been transformed, it's been baptized by the grace of Christ. And so this Mary Magdalene, this notorious title, becomes this amazing herald of the gospel. So that's the sort of mainstream traditional view. There is a view by a minority of scholars which says we don't really know much about the city of Magdala. Maybe it wasn't even called Magdala in Jesus' day. Magdala might have been a later invention by Christians. And so they say, actually, more likely, Magdalene comes from a root Aramaic word, and it means something like toweress or great one. And this is not a view to be dismissed out of hand. There's a couple of church fathers, such as Jerome, who seem to agree with this view. They say that in the same way that Jesus would apply titles and bestow titles on his closest followers, you think of Simon being renamed as Peter. Likewise, with Mary Magdalene, he gives her this title of the toweress or the great one. So that's a legitimate view to hold. I'm certainly partial to the former view. I think it's the more traditional view and makes most sense. But really, at the end of the day, either of these views is acceptable for the defender of the traditional position. We don't have to associate Mary Magdalene with the city of Magdala to understand that wherever she lived and whatever sort of her home base was, we know that she was a woman who had a reputation for being a sinner. She's the one who had the 7 demons driven out. She's the woman of the city. She's the one who, when she comes into the dinner party in Luke 7 and interrupts and anoints Jesus' feet, the reaction of the crowd very clearly implies this is a woman who is notorious and not in a good way. So that's some little background on the title of Mary Magdalene. Okay, so now we've talked about her title, we've talked about the traditional narrative. I think sort of drawing that together, there's a number of things worth pointing out. Firstly, just picture, I mean, I have in my notes some of the implications of this view when we take it to its logical conclusion. I mean, Mary Magdalene, traditionally understood, she goes from being this kind of background figure. I mean, if we'll talk in a second about the historical critical view or the feminist view. I mean, these completely impoverished, watered down views, these barren views of our saint, these barren views of our biblical heroine. They water her down to being this background figure. She's basically just mentioned in passing. She gets like the spotlight briefly at the resurrection, but that's about it. That's their view. Our view, the traditional view, is radically different. On the traditional view, we have more biographical information about Mary Magdalene than virtually any other New Testament woman, with the exception of Our Lady. I mean, if all of this comes together in the way that the tradition argues, if Aquinas and Augustine and Francis de Sales and Teresa of Avila and Catherine of Siena, all these saints and mystics who intuited the truth of the traditional view, if they're correct, then we can look at all these texts throughout the Gospels, seeing this as one woman, one heart devoted to Christ, then suddenly we know a huge amount about her compared to her contemporaries. We know that she was one of Jesus' best friends. She was a beloved daughter of God. She was a beloved disciple of Jesus. She's one of the New Testament's central heroines. That's what we know about her. I mean, she is the one who loved much. She is the one who sat there contemplating the one thing necessary. She's the one who did a beautiful thing for Christ. She's the one who moves the God-man to tears. She's the one whose deed, Jesus says, will be proclaimed throughout the world. She's the one who stood with him at Calvary. She's the one who first saw the risen Lord and believed. She is this champion of sinners. She's this amazing advocate for us. This figure who had this past, but who saw the light of Christ, who saw the beauty of grace, and who chose it. She chose that grace. She chose that beauty. And so she shows us in this unparalleled way the depth and the power of this life walked with Christ. And when you compare this to the modernist depictions, when you compare this to the historical critical scholars, you compare it to the feminist scholars, I mean, just think what they're left with. The historical critics, they have to say that Mary Magdalene, we know almost nothing about her. We know that she, for some reason, had 7 demons cast out of her. It's a passing detail. We know for some reason she stood at Calvary, and we know that she was at the resurrection. And from John, we know that for some random reason, Jesus chose her to be the one that he first appeared to. And that's it. I mean, we know that she bankrolled Jesus' ministry from Luke chapter 8. I mean, but that's all the information we have about her. So on the historical critical view, I mean, she's profoundly watered down. I mean, people like to say, Mary Magdalene, this amazing saint, but unless you accept the traditional view, she's not that extraordinary. I mean, certainly the honor of being the first witness of the resurrection, but on their view, there's no explanation for why she's the first witness. I mean, why is she chosen and not Mary of Bethany? Mary of Bethany is at least a dear friend of Jesus. She's the one who contemplated the one thing necessary, but somehow this previously more or less unknown figure, Mary Magdalene, takes pride of place at the resurrection. It doesn't make sense. It's a boring, lame, and ultimately irrational view of Mary Magdalene. And the feminist scholars are no better. We talked in our introduction about their kind of, what one author has called their puritanical prejudice. They feel icky about the idea of Mary Magdalene being a reformed prostitute. They think it's disparaging and demeaning. They think that Pope Gregory the Great and the medievals just made this up. They concocted it out of whole cloth because they were worried about the idea that the Gospels had a strong female figure, and so they had to say, oh, she actually had a dodgy past, and we're going to sort of downplay her that way. I mean, what a bizarre view to take. The reality, of course, is precisely the opposite. The medievals exulted in the idea that Mary Magdalene was a reformed prostitute. They exulted in the idea that she was a saint with a past. Tom Holland, a secular historian, has described how Mary Magdalene, the cult to Mary Magdalene, has this kind of startling impact in the Middle Ages of putting flesh on the bones of the idea of Jesus' words that prostitutes and sinners would enter the kingdom of God before priests and bishops. And the feminist scholars who have this cynical view of the church, the cynical view of the early and medieval church, they have no response to that. The reality is that we often, scholarly circles, they'll try to portray the medievals as backwards and ignorant, but the reality is precisely the opposite. The medievals, they championed the little guy, they championed the little girl, they championed Mary Magdalene, and they said that she is an amazing saint, and even when there were corrupt bishops and priests, she was a reminder of the truth of the gospel. She was a reminder that Jesus came to earth not to be buddy-buddy with the bishops and the priests. He didn't come to sort of, allow the hierarchy to live in wealth and comfort. No, he came to befriend sinners like Mary Magdalene, sinners like you and like me. That's what he came to do. And that is the beauty of the gospel message. And so as we've gone through this course, I think it's so important that we've drawn together this traditional view in the way that we have, because what it does is it opens up so many possibilities. It unlocks and unleashes the figure of Mary Magdalene for who I believe she really is and who the history and tradition of the church believes she really is. And I believe me that when you take this view to heart, and then you go back and read those gospel passages in which Mary appears, which our beloved Mary appears, whether it's her first anointing before her conversion when she comes in tears to Christ, or at the moment of her conversion, whether it's at the death of her brother Lazarus, whether it's when she sits there contemplating the one thing necessary, whether it's at Calvary, at the resurrection, wherever it might be, if you take this traditional narrative of her life and you bring that into your contemplation, you bring that into your meditation and prayer, suddenly the figure of Mary Magdalene comes to life in a whole new way. And I can't wait for you, if you haven't done so already, to get started on that journey of getting to know her, becoming friends of her the way that I did. And I just can't recommend her highly enough as a friend and as an intercessor in heaven. So in this episode, we've managed to sort of give some of the traditional narrative and to talk about its implications. And now in the next episode, the final episode, we're going to draw together the threads of the course to ask ourselves in practical terms, what does Mary Magdalene mean for the church and the world of today? What can she teach us, and what makes her this saint for our times, this 21st century saint who has so much to teach and give us today?